You've been lied to by comfort, conditioned by convenience, and softened by a world that always gave you a second chance. That illusion is your first enemy. Most people step into collapse believing they can figure it out. That instinct will save them. That gear equals capability. That mindset is lethal. The truth is simpler and far colder. The world doesn't care what you think you know. It only cares whether your tools still function when everything else has failed. Collapse removes the safety net you never realized you depended on. No resupply, no replacements, no infrastructure to absorb your mistakes. In this world, failure isn't an inconvenience, it's an endpoint. And the biggest mistake survivors make is assuming the rules of the old world still apply. They cling to fragile tools, fragile systems, and fragile thinking, believing effort can compensate for poor choices. It cannot. The environment is indifferent, and it will erase you for assuming otherwise. What you need now is not optimism, but operational clarity. Only the simplest, most brutally durable tools remain viable when time, weather, and entropy grind everything down. You're no longer choosing what is good. You're choosing what refuses to die. The margin for error evaporates, leaving you with a single requirement. Carry only what endures. Use only what cannot fail, and discard the illusions that once made you feel safe. The old world rewarded convenience. The collapsed world rewards permanence. And permanence begins with understanding that survival is not a feeling, it's a system. The post-collapse environment is not merely harsher, it is structurally different. Everything you once relied on, logistics, grid power, fuel distribution, emergency services, manufactured replacements, has evaporated. What remains is an ecosystem governed by decay, scarcity, and the absolute primacy of self-sufficiency. You are no longer operating in a world of solutions, but in a world of consequences. Every action interacts with an environment that gives nothing back unless forced. The conditions are mathematically hostile. Metal corrodes faster without controlled storage. Lubricants dry out or wash away. Plastics degrade under ultraviolet exposure. Electronics fail from moisture, dust, impact, or simple time. Anything dependent on a chemical reaction, a charged cell, a membrane, a moving joint, or a factory-made component becomes a countdown to failure. In this world, the question isn't, how well does it work? But how slowly does it die? The psychological shift is equally severe. Pre-collapse thinking centers on options, backups, and comfort-driven choices. Post-collapse thinking strips all of that away and replaces it with a singular metric: operational longevity. You stop asking what a tool can do at its best and start evaluating what it still does at its worst. You stop imagining solutions built on abundance and begin calculating survival through scarcity. Waste is no longer a mistake. It is a threat. Fatigue is no longer an inconvenience. It is a structural weakness. Every calorie, every movement, every decision is a debt to the environment, and the environment demands repayment. Once you recognize this shift, clarity emerges. Tools that depend on civilization die with civilization. Tools that stand independent of infrastructure become the backbone of survival. The operational environment doesn't reward innovation. It rewards inevitability. Tools that continue functioning, not because you maintain them, but because they are built to endure collapse itself. There is a reason the post-collapse world narrows all viable equipment down to 7 tool categories. It isn't preference, style, or survival mythology. It's mathematical elimination. Everything else fails. Modern gear dies from complexity. Tactical gear dies from dependence. Improvised gear dies from optimism. When you strip away every tool that requires fuel, batteries, spare parts, precision machining, delicate joints, or chemical stability, the list collapses into a small core of systems that continue working despite neglect, time, and environmental brutality. Most people make the same mistake. They start with what they want to carry instead of what the world will allow them to carry. They chase multi-functions, features, clever mechanisms, or online recommendations that assume a functioning civilization in the background. Collapse doesn't care about clever. Collapse rewards only what survives entropy, and entropy is ruthless in its selection process. The doctrine of the seven exists because these tools are not conveniences. They are universal functions: cutting, ignition, water conversion, environmental manipulation, structural binding, food acquisition, situational awareness. Remove any one of these, and the entire survival system becomes unbalanced. Strengthen them, and your capacity for endurance multiplies. The collapse world doesn't ask whether you are skilled, brave, or experienced. It asks whether your tools continue operating when reality strips them to their core. The seven endure because they obey the laws of physics, not the expectations of consumers. They are not gear. They are the skeletal framework of survival itself, the minimum architecture that keeps you alive when everything else has already failed. Cutting is the first non-negotiable function in any post-collapse environment, and the reason is brutally simple. Nothing else moves until the blade does. Shelter doesn't take shape. Fuel doesn't reduce to burnable form. Traps don't assemble. And food doesn't process without an edge that survives the world's hostility. Most people enter collapse with the wrong assumption. That versatility comes from features. In truth, versatility comes from permanence, and permanence in cutting tools belongs only to a fixed blade built to outlast the person carrying it. Every folding system eventually fails. Hinges loosen, locking mechanisms crack, springs corrode or seize from grit, freeze cycles, or organic debris. Even a premium folder is still a mechanical compromise engineered for convenience, not longevity. In collapse conditions, convenience becomes an obsolete luxury. When the environment strips everything to its essence, the blade that survives is the one with no moving parts, no weak joints, and no dependency on precision tolerances. A fixed blade becomes more than a tool. It becomes the primary interface between human intention and the physical world. You carve structural joints, split wood down to ignitable cores, process game, modify terrain, craft bindings, shape debris into shelter components, cut cordage, fabricate triggers, stakes, levers, frames, and the 1,000 other forms of quiet engineering that survival demands. In the absence of machines, the blade becomes the machine. In the absence of infrastructure, the blade becomes the infrastructure. The operational principle is this: a cutting tool must function in its worst state, not its best. Mud-smeared, rain-soaked, edge-dulled, grit-packed, heat-cycled. If it can still operate under those conditions, then it is collapse-worthy. A blade that requires careful storage is a liability. A blade that demands precision maintenance is a risk vector. A blade that survives despite abuse is an asset. People romanticize knives as weapons. In collapse, the blade earns its place by being a creator, not a destroyer. It builds what keeps you alive. It shapes every other tool. It transforms raw material into survival architecture. You don't carry a fixed blade because it's traditional. You carry it because physics leaves you no other option. In a world where everything decays, the cutting edge is the first proof that you still exist. Fire is not warmth, not comfort, not symbolism. In a true post-collapse world, fire is the only artificial life support system you can still produce with your own hands. It purifies water when filtration fails. It sterilizes tools when infection becomes a predator. It dries soaked clothing, preserves food, hardens wood, signals distance, repels animals, and reinforces your psychological stability when the environment strips you down to instinct. Without fire, every other survival action becomes a losing equation. With fire, you regain the single force multiplier that civilization once hid behind electricity. Most people enter collapse carrying the wrong ignition systems. They trust lighters because they worked in civilization. They trust matches because they worked in comfort. But collapse punishes everything that depends on fuel, seals, pressure, or chemical coatings. Butane leaks, sparks weaken, wheels jam, matches lose coating or absorb moisture until they disintegrate. Flint wheel lighters become dead metal once the internal gas or ferro strip wears out. Every modern fire tool operates on a countdown. It works flawlessly until the moment it doesn't, and that moment is always sooner than you expect. A ferro rod is different because it refuses to die on schedule. It doesn't depend on fuel, pressure, or precision manufacturing. It tolerates moisture, cold, heat cycles, neglect, and abuse that would destroy every other ignition source. It produces sparks even when corroded, scraped against stone, dragged through mud, or after years of exposure. It is not the easiest tool for beginners, but collapse does not reward ease. It rewards inevitability. The ferro rod is inevitable fire. Fire itself becomes a doctrine. You stop treating it as an event and start treating it as a system. You gather materials before you need them, not when desperation closes in. You learn the landscape's fuel cycles, dryness patterns, bark structures, sap content, and wind corridors. You create redundancy in tinder, not redundancy in tools. Fire becomes a habit, not a reaction. In collapse, those who wait for cold before learning fire die from cold before learning fire. Ignition in this world is about sovereignty, your ability to turn dead vegetation into energy, safety, and structure without depending on anything manufactured, replaced, or recharged. The ferro rod works not because it's clever, but because entropy cannot stop it from functioning. When everything around you collapses into darkness, the tool that still creates fire becomes the dividing line between existence and disappearance. Water in a post-collapse world is not a resource. It is a threat. Every source you find is compromised by runoff, decay, animal contamination, stagnation, or industrial residue that will outlast the civilization that created it. The majority of survivors die not from dehydration, but from the pathogens they consume trying to prevent it. The mistake comes from pre-collapse conditioning. People assume water is clean enough if it looks clear. In collapse, clarity means nothing. The microbial load doesn't negotiate, and your immune system, already weakened by stress, hunger, and exposure, cannot compensate for misjudgment. Most filtration systems people carry are engineered for weekend reliability, not indefinite survival. Membranes clog, housings crack, flow rates collapse in cold conditions. Hollow fibers degrade from freezing or microscopic fractures. Chemical treatments expire or lose potency. Pumps require seals, lubricants, and delicate tolerances. Every modern filtration device shares the same flaw. It depends on components that cannot be replaced once the world stops producing them. When those systems fail, and they always do, you're left with contaminated water and no backup. This is why the post-collapse world reduces all water strategy to a simple truth. You must possess a tool, that enables thermal purification or mechanical pre-filtration using materials you can extract from the environment indefinitely. The ability to boil is the only purification method that does not degrade, expire, or become useless with time. But boiling is not possible with your bare hands. It requires the right tool, metal that survives fire, resists deformation, and can move water from contaminated sources to heat. A steel container becomes more than storage. It becomes the heart of your water protocol. With it, you can boil in open flame, produce steam distillation, pasteurize, reduce turbidity, and melt ice without chemical contamination. Complementing it, a simple fabric or improvised sediment filter, cloth, charcoal, sand, functions as a mechanical pre-cleaner that never runs out because you recreate it from the environment. Nothing delicate, nothing replaceable. Only what regenerates. Water strategy in collapse also demands discipline. You do not drink directly from sources no matter how desperate. You do not trust rainfall unless collected properly. You do not assume ground seepage is safer than stream flow. Every decision must pass through the singular doctrine. Untreated water is a biological attack vector. The modern world convinced you that hydration is simple. The collapsed world reminds you that water kills as efficiently as hunger or infection, unless controlled. The tool that lets you boil indefinitely, paired with pre-filtration you can rebuild forever, is the only water system that survives the death of civilization. Everything else is a slow failure disguised as convenience. Shelter in a post-collapse world is not a structure. It is control over exposure. Wind, rain, temperature swings, and ground moisture become predators as lethal as any hostile human. Most people enter collapse believing shelter is about comfort, but comfort is extinct. Shelter is the difference between maintaining core temperature and losing the slow, invisible battle against hypothermia, heat exhaustion, or microbial infection. And the brutal truth is this: you cannot build, modify, or reinforce any environment without leverage. Collapse strips you down to the physics of force, weight, and material resistance, and only one category of tools consistently overcomes those limitations. The shelter manipulator is the tool that multiplies your strength. Axes, hatchets, machetes, and pry tools, simple machines that turn your limited human output into structural capability. Without them, you are reduced to dragging branches, stacking debris, or crawling into whatever natural voids the environment offers. That is not shelter, that is surrender. The moment you hold a tool designed to cut, split, pry, wedge, or shape heavy material, you transition from occupant to architect. An axe or hatchet allows you to process timber, reduce logs, create joinery points, split firewood, shape supports, and harvest materials that would be impossible to manipulate by hand. A machete lets you clear vegetation, carve framework, create flexible components, and adapt to dense terrain. A pry bar or similar leverage tool shifts stone, opens sealed structures, recovers salvage, and breaks apart debris that becomes both obstacle and resource. Collapse does not care about brand names or aesthetics. It cares about raw mechanical advantage. People underestimate how quickly exposure kills. A single night below comfort threshold drains energy reserves you cannot replace. A poorly constructed shelter allows moisture intrusion, which accelerates heat loss. A weak structure collapses under wind or snow load. These failures do not happen because survivors lack creativity. They happen because they lack the right leverage. You cannot improvise mechanical advantage with bare hands. You cannot bend the environment without force magnification. and you cannot force anything without a tool designed to deliver that force again and again without failing. The operational rule is simple. Shelter is labor converted into structure. Without the tool that amplifies your output, that conversion never reaches completion. The environment remains stronger than you. With it, you bend terrain, timber, debris, and abandoned infrastructure into forms that sustain life. In collapse, shelter is the first engineering problem you must solve, and the shelter manipulator is the only category of tools that lets you solve it before exposure solves you. Binding is the invisible architecture of survival, yet it's the element most people overlook because it doesn't feel dramatic. In the modern world, everything is pre-assembled, pre-fastened, pre-engineered. Collapse erases all of that. Suddenly, every structure, every trap, every repair, every shelter joint, every splint, every pack modification, every tool handle, every stretcher, every brace, every repair becomes a problem of connection. And connection requires a system that can survive friction, moisture, tension, abrasion, and time. Without binding, nothing holds. Without something that holds, nothing lasts. People enter collapse imagining cordage is easy to improvise. They picture vines, roots, strips of cloth, maybe a belt. That illusion collapses the moment real load is applied. Natural fibers rot, snap, or fray. Clothing tears under repeated tension. Makeshift bindings work for minutes, not days. Survival is not about temporary fixes. It's about systems that endure repeated stress cycles without failure. That is why collapse reduces all binding solutions down to a brutally small set. Cordage you can rely on, wire you can shape, and the tools that allow you to manipulate both with precision and force. A strong, rot-resistant cord becomes an extension of your engineering ability. With it, you lash beams, tension shelters, suspend food, reinforce packs, craft triggers, form snares, build stretchers, create harnesses, and anchor almost every structural element you interact with. Wire adds another dimension. It lets you create rigid frameworks, form trap mechanisms, repair metal components, bind heavy loads, and execute tasks where flexibility becomes a weakness. What turns material into structure is not creativity, it's binding. But the binding system is more than just what you carry, it's also what you can recreate. Collapse rewards survivors who understand how to manufacture primitive cordage from bark, sinew, plant fibers, or salvaged synthetic strands. It rewards those who can strip wire from abandoned infrastructure, retwist frayed strands, or fabricate braided lines. And it punishes those who rely entirely on finite supplies without knowing how to generate more. The operational principle behind the binding system is structural continuity. The idea that survival is not defined by what you build once, but by what stays intact under repeated stress. A shelter that collapses in the night isn't shelter. A trap that fails under strain isn't a trap. A repair that loosens under movement isn't a repair. Collapse does not care how well something was assembled, it cares how long it stays together. Binding is the difference between temporary and functional, between assembled and engineered, between surviving today and surviving the next storm, the next load, the next failure. Without it, everything falls apart, literally. Food in a post-collapse world is not something you hunt, find, or hope for. It is something you convert from the environment through systems that continue working, even when you are exhausted, cold, injured, or out of strength. Most people imagine survival food as a matter of skill, tracking, stalking, chasing. That fantasy collapses the moment hunger strips your energy reserves and turns every high-effort action into a losing equation. Collapse doesn't reward the strongest. It rewards the survivor who understands that calories are a currency, and hunting is almost always a negative investment. This is why modern survival myths fail. People cling to the cinematic idea of taking down large game with heroism and improvisation. But collapse rewrites the math. Big animals require energy to track, energy to kill, energy to process, and energy to preserve. The cost exceeds the gain unless conditions are perfect, conditions that collapse will never give you. The post-collapse survivor shifts from pursuit predation to mechanical acquisition, because only systems that work while you rest produce sustainable calories. Traps become the true food engine because they don't rely on your stamina. They operate in the background while you manage shelter, fire, water, repair, or movement. They don't get tired, don't lose focus, and don't panic. Simple deadfalls, snares, trigger-based mechanisms, spring pole systems, and funnel traps create a passive network of opportunity. They exploit animal behavior rather than fight it. And most importantly, they don't consume calories to produce calories. Primitive trap systems, wood, cordage, wire, shaped stone, can be built indefinitely, rebuilt when destroyed, and replicated across multiple zones. The tools you carry aren't the traps themselves. They are the tools that let you shape traps from the environment. Your cutting tool for notches and triggers, your binding system for snares and lashings, your shelter manipulator for shaping heavier components. The food engine exists only because these seven work together. Processing food is equally critical. Once acquired, meat must be cleaned, portioned, and preserved without refrigeration. This demands the ability to carve, scrape, smoke, dry, or harden protein before it spoils. A dependable blade and a consistent fire system turn perishable resources into shelf-stable calories. Without them, every successful catch becomes a race against decomposition. The operational truth is simple. Collapse eliminates abundance, and only those who convert micro-opportunities into consistent intake survive. A trap that works once is luck. A trap network that works daily is strategy. Food acquisition isn't an act, it's an engine, a repeating mechanism that replaces the industrial food system that died with civilization. When the world stops feeding you, the tools that keep your traps running become the closest thing you have to a renewable food supply. Situational awareness in a post-collapse world is not a mindset. It is a survival organ. When the grid dies, when communications vanish, when optics fog, when batteries drain, when sensors fail, you are left with the only detection system collapse cannot disable: your ability to read terrain, track movement, interpret patterns, and anticipate threats before they materialize. Most people enter collapse believing danger is visible. It isn't. Danger is silent until the moment it isn't, and by then the outcome is already decided. Modern life conditioned you to outsource awareness. Cameras, lights, alerts, crowds, police presence, layers of artificial consciousness that once created a buffer between you and threats. Collapse removes that buffer with surgical precision. Suddenly, the environment speaks again. Broken twigs, displaced soil, unnatural silence, tool marks, scat distribution, animal trails, weather shifts, wind corridors. The problem is simple. Most people have forgotten how to listen. The situational awareness amplifier isn't a gadget. It is a set of primitive, durable tools that extend your senses instead of replacing them. A simple mirror becomes a low-tech observation device for checking blind angles without exposing yourself. A reliable compass keeps your mind oriented when fatigue blurs your internal mapping. A grease pencil or charcoal marker lets you track routes, mark danger zones, and maintain territorial awareness. A basic optical lens, non-electronic, non-digital, can magnify detail without depending on power or circuitry. None of these tools are fragile. None rely on complex systems. All amplify perception. Tracking tools, sticks for distance pacing, cordage markers for path mapping, improvised perimeter lines with noise indicators, become early warning systems that require no maintenance and last indefinitely. These are the tools that turn the environment into a sensor network, one where every disturbance signals information and every consistent pattern reveals behavior. Collapse rewards whoever reads the world more accurately and more consistently than their adversaries. Awareness is also anticipation. You stop wandering. You start observing. You stop reacting. You start predicting. The toolset that sharpens your perception becomes a force multiplier more powerful than any weapon. Violence only matters if you see it coming. Predators, human or animal, only lose their advantage when you erase the element of surprise. In collapse, blindness is not the absence of sight. It is the absence of understanding. The tools that amplify your awareness don't just keep you informed. They keep you alive long before the threat reaches you. The 7 are not independent categories. They are interlocking systems that form a closed-loop architecture of survival. A fixed blade shapes the materials your shelter manipulator must leverage. That shelter manipulator processes the timber that structures your camp, protects your fire, and anchors your binding system. Binding holds the frames that support traps, reinforce containers, secure tools, and stabilize everything the blade cuts. Fire purifies the water you carry in a container shaped or repaired with the same blade and binding synergy. Water sustains the body required to maintain awareness, move traps, and execute repairs. Situational awareness protects every one of the tools by preventing ambush, theft, or environmental miscalculation. And the food engine powered by traps only exists because cutting, binding, and fire combine to construct, maintain, and preserve what those traps produce. This is why collapse eliminates the luxury of specialization. No single tool keeps you alive. No single category sustains itself. Weakness in one becomes weakness in all. If your cutting tool fails, shelter decays. If shelter decays, fire becomes inconsistent. If fire becomes inconsistent, water becomes unsafe. If water is unsafe, awareness collapses through fatigue and sickness. If awareness collapses, traps fail or predators approach unnoticed. Collapse punishes gaps with geometric precision. Integration means understanding that survival is not linear, but circular. Strength comes from the continuity of the loop, not the strength of a single link. The 7 function as a system because they remove dependency on civilization and replace it with dependency on physics, materials, leverage, heat, tension, perception, and biological need. When all 7 operate together, your environment becomes negotiable. When even one fails, the negotiation ends. In the post-collapse world, you don't carry tools. You carry a system. And systems, not individuals, are what endure when everything else breaks. Collapse punishes fantasy. And nowhere is the punishment harsher than in the habits people carry from the old world. They assume effort can compensate for structural mistakes, that determination can fix poor choices, that improvisation can replace engineering. These assumptions become fatal the moment the environment stops forgiving them. The most common failure mode is simple. Survivors treat collapse like an adventure instead of a system. They rely on tools that worked in comfort, trust shortcuts that worked in safety, and bet their lives on gear designed for convenience instead of continuity. The first collapse error is overestimating durability. People carry tools with joints, hinges, coatings, membranes, and electronics, believing brand reputation equals resilience. But collapse destroys weak points without hesitation. A cracked water filter, a frozen lighter, a dull bargain blade, a folding mechanism packed with grit. These failures aren't inconveniences, they cascade. A failed lighter forces reliance on untested ignition methods. A failed shelter tool forces makeshift construction that leaks heat. Makeshift construction forces higher caloric burn to stay warm. Higher caloric burn accelerates starvation. Starvation reduces awareness. Reduced awareness invites danger. Collapse is a chain reaction, and the weak link always breaks first. The second failure is emotional decision-making. Hunger makes people gamble on spoiled food. Thirst drives them to drink untreated water. Fear pushes them to move when they should stay put. Pride convinces them they can push through instead of rebuilding a system properly. Collapse eliminates the buffer that once absorbed these mistakes. Emotion becomes a liability. The third failure is misunderstanding time. Survival isn't about heroic moments. It's about repetition. A trap must work every day, not once. A shelter must hold through storms, not hours. A fire system must ignite in rain, not just in demonstrations. Survivors fail because they evaluate tools at their best, not their worst. Collapse evaluates only at the worst. And finally, the fatal failure. Believing collapse can be negotiated. It cannot. The world is indifferent, the physics unchanging, the consequences immediate. You don't adapt the 7 tools to your preferences. You adapt yourself to their operational laws. Collapse kills those who refuse that shift and sustains those who treat reality like the only authority that matters. Endurance in a post-collapse world is not strength, skill, or luck. It is discipline. Civilization trained you to chase comfort, efficiency, and convenience. Collapse replaces those values with a single doctrine. Consistency sustains life, and inconsistency destroys it. You cannot negotiate with exposure, fatigue, or scarcity. You can only outlast them through structure, routine, and an acceptance that survival is built on repetition, not inspiration. The 7 tools are not gear. They are laws. They demand maintenance even when you're tired, planning even when you're hungry, and vigilance even when you're afraid. You sharpen the blade because dullness compounds into wasted energy. You build fire prep before sundown because darkness erases opportunity. You process water before you're thirsty because prevention is the only medicine left. You reset traps daily because food isn't guaranteed. You reinforce shelter before the storm, not during it. You inspect bindings before they fail, not after. And you study your surroundings not when danger appears, but when everything seems quiet, because quiet is a warning in disguise. The psychological shift is brutal. You stop living reactively and start living operationally. Emotion becomes secondary to protocol. Hope is replaced by assessment. Fear is replaced by procedure. Comfort is replaced by continuity. You endure not by being exceptional, but by refusing to break the cycle of small, necessary actions that prevent catastrophe. The world before collapse allowed you to make mistakes. The world after collapse counts them. Survival is the mathematics of discipline, inputs and outputs, actions and consequences, repetition and reward. Endurance is not a moment of heroism. It is the endless string of decisions that prevent you from slipping into the chaos waiting outside your perimeter. In the end, the 7 tools remain because they mirror the only truth that still applies. What endures, survives, and in collapse, the tool that must endure most consistently is you.